Welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Jan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. I'm Jacob Levy, the Lin Center's director. The Lin Center is an exciting new development in the intellectual life of McGill, seeking to promote excellence and interdisciplinary exchange in humanistic social inquiry, bringing together researchers from departments and faculties as varied as political science, history, philosophy, classics, law, and engineering. The center will provide McGill's focal point for normative and historical scholarship about social and political life. The center encompasses a number of research groups, some new, some already existing, and moving into it. These are Global Antiquities, coordinated by Hans Beck and Griet Vankerbergen; Transitions and Global Modernities, coordinated by Anastasios Anastasiadis and Lorenz Luthi; Constitutional Studies, which I coordinate; Global Justice, Catherine Liu; and Democracy, Space, and Technology, Ipek Tureli. While tonight marks the inauguration of the center as a whole, the research groups have already been active all year and in some cases before. And I would like to mention a few of their activities and events to give you a flavor of what the center is bringing into McGill's intellectual life. So far this year, the center's research groups have sponsored lectures on provinces and monarchies in the ancient Chinese and Roman empires, and on the archaeological and art history of ancient China and the West, an exhibition of the art of the Arab uprisings, and a lecture on Arab political anti-colonial mobilization, sessions on the refugee crisis and racism in Hungary, and on how refugees can contribute to the political settlement of the crises that drove them from their homes, a public lecture on the ethics of open immigration, and a public debate on the idea that liberty is founded on the idea that we own ourselves. We study ideals of domestic liberty and global justice and the history of those ideals, the physical space, built environment, and technological structures of democratic societies, the emergence of modern political life and its antecedents across the whole of the ancient world. Comparisons across eras and regions characterize our work together, as does the integration of studying political and social transformations in history with the study of the ideas that animate them and the study of the physical space that structures them. After tonight, our next event is a collaborative conference in May on the spatial and temporal dimensions of educational globalization, the Eastern Mediterranean in transnational perspective, 1850s to today. In addition to lectures, workshops, and conferences, our research groups house activities ranging from research workshops for faculty to reading groups for undergraduates to visual arts exhibitions. And once per year, we will all come together in an event like this one, not tied to any one of the research groups in particular, but bringing to McGill a leading scholar who can speak to the themes of the center's research as a whole. This has all been made possible by a generous gift to McGill by Dr. Jan P. Lin, PhD class of 1992, whom I will thank more formally at the conclusion of this evening's lecture. But for now, I turn to the reason you've all come. Given the combination of interests that make up the center, given our commitment to range across regions of the world and eras of history, and given our concern, among other things, with the idea of freedom and the history of that idea, there was just no question who it was we wanted to deliver the center's inaugural lecture. Orlando Patterson is John Cole's professor of sociology at Harvard University, a world leader in historical sociology, cultural sociology, the sociology of race and ethnicity, and the study of development and the Caribbean. He's held appointments at the London School of Economics and the University of West Indies. He served for 8 years as an advisor for social policy and development to Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley. He's the author of books including The Cultural Matrix, including Understanding Black Youth, Rituals of Blood, The Consequences of Slavery in 2 American Centuries, The Ordeal of Integration, Progress and Resentment in America's Racial Crisis, as well as 3 novels. Among his honors, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's been recognized with the Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award of the American Sociological Association, and is co-winner of the Ralph Bunche Award for the Best Book on Pluralism from the American Political Science Association. He's been awarded the Order of Distinction by the Government of Jamaica and the Gold Musgrave Award by the Institute of Jamaica. Just last week, he was recognized with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Anisfield Wolf Book Awards presented by the Cleveland Foundation. And he's the author of Slavery and Social Death and of the National Book Award-winning Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, a pair of works that even decades after their publication can still astonish. They are ambitious in their historical and geographic sweep, bold and controversial in their central claims about the relationships of master and slaves and of the ideas of slavery and freedom. They are adept at weaving together ideas and arguments from sociology, philosophy, history, and law. They're accessible to students, but still sources of new insight for any scholars. They stand as inspiring examples of the kind of scholarship to which we, and we in this new center especially, should aspire. Please join me in welcoming to McGill Professor Orlando Patterson.
Thank you so much, Professor Levy. That was a wonderful introduction, which I hope I deserve. Let me say also that I'm extremely pleased and honored to be invited to give this inaugural lecture for the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Culture in the Ancient and Modern World. As someone who has spent his lifetime studying cultures comparatively and historically, I consider this a labor of love. And just between us, I'd have been happy to do it even without the very generous honorarium. I grew up in the poor hinterland of a small British colony at the end of empire. Had my formative intellectual years in England at the London School of Economics. Spent most of my academic years in America. I advised governments here and in Jamaica. In all of this, though, freedom and its strange twin, slavery, have been my central preoccupation. And in a way, it's what brings together all these seemingly disparate interests. And tonight, it's my great pleasure to be able to reflect on these themes again in what would seem to be a most appropriate setting. Freedom, I need hardly remind you, is the most central and most cherished, the most contested value in Western civilization. And with its 20th century globalization in the world. So my objectives tonight is, first, to ask and suggest some reasons why this is so. Why freedom? How did a tight cluster of beliefs we call freedom attain such centrality? Secondly, how, when, and where was this value invented or socially constructed? Third, and to anticipate, since I'll be arguing that it was a constructed value in the West some 2,500 years ago and remained quintessentially a Western value right down to the middle of the last century, my third task will be to offer some reasonable explanation for this civilizational affinity and to anticipate the many outraged responses of those who argue that, in fact, this is an ethnocentric claim. There's a question, too, of continuity. I'll be arguing contrary to modern accounts, that the history of freedom in the West is astonishing in its unbroken continuity. I'll argue that there is no medieval lacunae, no thousand-year break with the ancient construction of the value. Indeed, this will be one of my main objectives tonight. Attempting such a task may strike many of you as reckless, not simply because of the vast span of history, but because of the very nature of the questions that motivate my effort. For many of you, the very question, why is freedom so important, may seem odd, as is the attempt to find out the origins and social invention of freedom. Is the existence of freedom not self-evident, you may ask? Is freedom not an inherent part of the human condition? As Locke famously put it, is it not written in the hearts of men and presumably women? Or as Rousseau once asked and stated flatly, that we're all born free, ever wearing chains? This is the sort of fundamental assumption of the universality of freedom. The view that freedom is self-evident, and its implication that questions about its origin and construction are pointless, is in my view thoroughly wrong-headed. And it rests on what I call the universalist fallacy. And this fallacy, unfortunately, bedevils most accounts of freedom. It informs the vast majority of works written by philosophers on the subject, political theorists, and not a few historians. The universalist fallacy accounts for the prescriptivist nature of most studies of freedom. For if we assume that it's an inherent quality, then all the philosopher or theorist of freedom has to do is sit in his armchair and introspect. From a few reasonable premises about human nature, he or she can deduce what freedom really is, or at any rate should be. The study of freedom then becomes a game among the learned to see who is cleverest in deciphering its inherent qualities. From this, it also follows that the history of freedom amounts to no more or less than the history of what very smart men and occasional women have reflected on the nature of freedom. From Plato to Zeno to Cicero to Locke, Pufendorf and Mill, up to Sir Isaiah Berlin and Rawls and all the other smart thinkers on the subject. Let me hasten to add that I have no problems with philosophers, and I'll be citing many of them here. But the simple truth of the comparative global history is that outside of the West, nearly all peoples, for nearly the entire span of Western history until Western contact, found no reason to celebrate or institutionalize freedom. Other values, many quite possibly far more important, let me add, honor, love, nirvana, justice, warfare, security, the unity of heaven and earth, whatever, have preoccupied them. And who are we to say that they're not more important? In only a few non-Western languages is there even a pre-Western word for freedom. And when such a word existed, or when in response to provocative missionaries writing their dictionaries before returning home, having spent years not converting anyone, they was asked, well, what is your word for freedom? I can imagine the response. Freedom, what's that? Well, come on, you must have a word for freedom. And the native will then say, okay, you tell me what you're getting at. And the missionary explains what he's getting at. And invariably the response reflected, and you can do it yourself, in what the sort of original literal response is. It's always something like sensuousness, or something unpleasant. That indicates just what is sort of original response. Of course, this is no longer the case. So in light of all this, a universal assumption has had dangerous consequences, let me say. This is not just a parlor game. If you assume that freedom is written in the hearts of men, then it's okay and right that you send your army in to impose freedom on people. Yeah, Iraqis are all having it there written in their hearts. So if the army comes in, they'll be greeted as deliverers, right? Right. So let me begin by noting that when I speak of freedom, I'm not speaking just of an idea. This is not just a concept to be played with. It's a culturally constructed module, a set of ideas and beliefs and attendant practices. These ideas and beliefs have a recognizable subjective coherence, by which I mean that they can be shown to be meaningful and cohere hermeneutically. Cultural coherence, of course, in no way implies logical consistency, which is what philosophers strive for. There's nothing logical about the history of freedom. It's also important to note that this is an ensemble of ideas and beliefs. So please do not do what some of my friends will do, sort of dig up somewhere in the 5th century of India or somewhere else the fact that some wise man came up with the idea of freedom and so on. Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, the ideas are quite simple, so it's inevitable that one would find that. But the important point I'm going to be making is that freedom is not just an idea. It's a cultural, coherent set of cultural beliefs, highly institutionalized, highly valorized. And nowhere else in the world do we find that. Nowhere else in the world do we find people running around saying, yippee, isn't it great to be free? And we will die for freedom. Give me freedom or give me death. Many people consider that a rather stupid idea. So this is what I'm going to try to argue tonight. But first of all, let me see how we come to know this freedom, if not by sitting in one's armchair and philosophizing. I use, interestingly, ironically, a method advocated by one of our greatest philosophers, the endoxic method of Aristotle. Not through speculation, through this descriptivist, revisionist strategy of philosophers, which has its place, let me say, as you'll see when I quote them, but through researching what Aristotle called endoxa. That's a commonplace, consensual, more reputable set of beliefs on a subject, held by the many, as he said, and the wise of a group, as distinct from ideas judged in the light of truth. Aristotle returns to this over and over again in the topics, in the rhetoric, and in the ethics. And his advice is to gather the endoxic phenomena on the subject, search them, consider them carefully, see if you can find some coherence in them, usually what the wise do. And Martha Nussbaum, one of my favorite classicists, has done an excellent interpretation of the fact that this is Aristotle's method, in spite of the fact that many philosophers are very unhappy about this fact. It is what informs my historical sociology of culture. So what is freedom? Let's begin at the end. Ever since its invention in the late 5th century, it's been a tripartite complex of beliefs around power. Power. This may strike you as startling, since in the liberal tradition, of course, freedom is often contrasted with power. But it's the experience and idea of power that gives the belief its meaning. Freedom is first the valorization of liberation or release from the power or control of another agent, or the capacity to resist that negative freedom. Usually another person's, intrusion, but an institution or material force. We are free to the degree that we are no longer under the power of another agent. Freedom, secondly, has always meant the power to do what one wants, to fulfill one's desire with the minimum of constraint. For most of Western history, this positive view of freedom included, alas, the power to do with another person what one pleased. This is not philosophy. I'm not talking about the best ideas of freedom. You'll hear many unpleasant things about freedom before the end of this talk. This is the endoxa, an observation of what the phenomena of freedom is as the consensus of opinion through the ages. And this is there, central. Right down to the late 19th century, this idea in many parts of the Western world was openly advocated. And nowhere more than the United States. What do you think the South was fighting for? Liberty. The liberty to enslave its thousands of blacks. That idea, of course, was not inconsistent with the Western endoxa on freedom. It's an idea very familiar to the Greeks, okay? And we'll see that it pervades Western thought and continues to do so. Only in the 19th century was the qualification added that one was positively free to do what one pleases so long as it did not harm others. Mill, of course, is well known for this principle. The third constitutive notion of freedom is just as important, is the idea that one is free to the degree that one shares in the public or communal power of one society. This is the idea of freedom, it's participation, civic freedom. People power, the power of the demos. It is often expressed as freedom as belonging, or in more advanced societies, citizenship. However expressed, the basic idea here is that one is free only to the degree that one has the right to share equally in the public life of one society, should one choose to. Equal claims in public life is the central idea here. Okay? These three notions are held in tension with each other. I like to use the metaphor of a caudal triad to understand it, that they're always there. That at its best, freedom involves this triad, the tension of these three ideas. And, as we'll see, danger lies when this is broken up, when there's a defragmenting of this triad and claims are made about one or the other. Freedom as power, freedom exclusively as equality, freedom exclusively as a negative individualism. This triad is the source of Western freedom at its best and informs all Western thought, even by those who may emphasize one or the other. In fact, the history of freedom is the tendency to emphasize one or the other, even if held in the triad, and the tension between groups as to who will define the message of what freedom is. It was in Athens in the 5th century BC that these ideas and beliefs first congealed into the fused cultural product we call freedom. I've tried to show that the social construction was made possible by the relation to slavery. Slavery had first to exist before people could even conceive of the idea of freedom as value. That is to say, find it meaningful and useful as an ideal to be striven for. Before slavery came into the world, freedom was an absurdity so extreme that none but the most perverse of human beings would have thought about it. And had they done so, would have kept it quietly to themselves. This is so because where there is no slavery, all human beings desired to belong, to be mutually embraced and protected by those individuals and groups they knew and cherished. In short, to be bonded. In most traditional societies, and certainly most kin-based societies, the worst position you could be in is to be outside of the bond of kinship. In fact, such a condition was considered the quintessence of slavery. You didn't want to be isolated, running around and saying you're free. So that idea, that very unusual idea, required something for it to happen. And that something was slavery. Everywhere that slavery made its appearance, it became possible to conceive of the three notes of the chord of freedom, and sometimes to realize proto-historical versions of them. That's why, as I said, I'm not surprised to hear that in some part of the world, people sort of talked about this. Slavery immediately made possible something that had never existed before. The complete and total domination of one person by another, unmediated by others. So that immediately suggested something of value. That it is good not to be under the constraint of this person. If you do something which has never happened in traditional society, which is to say that you belong to me, you are socially dead, you are my product, you are my object, you are degraded, you have no life or soul except outside of me. You are an extension of my ego, which is what slavery is about, which is what the master claims. You've made someone socially dead. What would they want? What would they desire more than anything else but to escape this social death, this utter degradation? And of course, there is a perverse symmetry in slavery. Because if you define someone as totally degraded, without any being except as an extension of yourself, without history, without kinship, you've in fact created a rather discouraged worker, haven't you? If you're socially dead, you might as well be physically dead. You certainly don't want to work for that person. But slavery offers this perverse incentive. What could the master do to motivate this critter, this strange person, object he's created? Simply, I promise you your freedom if you're a good slave. This is the most powerful motivation. Slave works his butt off all his life until he's almost ready to drop in the grave. You said, okay, you're free now. It worked. It's ingenious. The Romans played this game beautifully. But slavery also, of course, did something else. I've just explained it. It did something else which existed in other societies. It gave someone power, absolute power over another. Freedom as power. Finally, slavery did the third thing, which is often neglected. In a traditional society where there's no slaves, obviously it makes absolute no sense to go around saying you're free, since everyone is, right? Only in the presence of a group of people who are slave does the thing called the freeman come about. It's by no accident then that the deepest linguistic root of the word freedom actually is translated, the best translation by historical linguists is beloved. We of the beloved. I'm not quite sure where Toni Morrison got her title from, that Indo-European root of the word, but whatever. The beloved, we who are free men, not freedmen, free men. So now you have three groups of people, right? Advocating three kinds of freedom. Freedom as power. I am free because I can do as I please with this person. I can rape her, I can do anything I want. That's freedom. We wince at thinking about it now, but the Greeks and the Romans had no problems celebrating that. When Nicias went to Syracuse to conquer Syracuse and got his butt whipped and he had to flee, he turned to his soldiers and his sailors and gave them a speech in which he said, we come from Athens, the freest city in the world. But he had gone to conquer and enslave another city. There's no contradiction. Now, to have a value is one thing, but to institutionalize it is another. And, I said that slavery existed all over the world. That's the point, that's one of the central theses of slavery and social death. So why didn't freedom then emerge all over the world? Aha. And why is it distinctly Western? Well, the point is that something else had to emerge. For something to emerge from what just the musings of a slave. When you think about it, it's a pretty perverse idea that you'd want to celebrate something that the slaves celebrate. And in fact, in most pre-Greek societies, all over the ancient Near East, where there was freedom, the thing you wanted to do most is to forget the hell about that. You didn't want to go around celebrating it. So what happened? What happened for this rather strange set of ideas to become not only a cultural value, but the preeminent value in the civilization? You begin to see why this is such a puzzle, I hope. It's a weird idea. And so I wanted to explain why this weird idea came about. And the reason why it emerged in ancient Greece, most noteworthy Athens, it may have occurred in others, but we know most about Athens, is that something else had to happen. We had to move from the micro to the macro, the sociologists would say. That something else is what Sir Moses Finlay, the great classicist, called slave society. You had to move from societies which are merely slave-holding, which we find all over the world, China, Japan, all over the pre-literate societies, Africa, and so on. So slave society, a society in which became structurally dependent on the institution of slavery. And we know when that first emerged. It never emerged in the ancient Near East in spite of the vast expanse of slavery there. It's not in biblical slavery. It first happened in Greece. For all sort of complex reasons, which I don't have the time to get into, which I'll be happy to answer in the question time. But there emerged then, over the course of the 6th century, culminating in the latter half of the 5th century, this extraordinary idea. A ancient dual economy, resulting from what was a liberating act, the end of the 7th century BC, the near revolt of debt bondsmen leading Solon and the leadership of Athens to, in a sense, abolish debt bondage. But in doing that, they create a labor crisis for the elite, who had no one to work for them anymore. The last thing they would ever do is to mess around with work for anyone. So you had to go out and find them, and it's the only way you could go. This is before the era of immigration. You couldn't bring immigrants in as the American elites do now. They would if they could. Well, the only way you could get an immigrant to come and work for you is to enslave him or her. Simple as that. And so you had a large-scale growth of slavery, primarily in the urban areas and in the silver mines, okay? Not in the rural areas. So you had two groups of people independent of each other for the first time. And out of this emerged a tension, a constant tension, because the Greek masses, what they always wanted actually was more land. And they never got it. In a nutshell, what the history of the 6th century shows is a rather clever response by the elites as the push for more security. Guys wanting to not be a debt bondsman anymore, but they still didn't have land, was met increasingly with political gifts. And so over the decades, there slowly emerged then the idea of a band of people who were distinctive in not being slaves, who were being brought in. And later on, the chauvinistic idea in being Greek and in being free. Anyway, the history of democracy, as Finley and any number of scholars have shown, very closely linked to the rise of slavery. So that by the end of the 5th century, you had these three ideas very powerfully established. With different groups, you can see the contestation from the beginning, with different groups emphasizing one or other of the card, although all groups emphasize it. So, for the mass, the hoplite, the fundamental idea of freedom, of course, is people power, democracy. For the elite, freedom as power. Arete and other notions were sort of fused with it, but that was critical. For the mass of the ex-slave, when there's a large group, metics, others, freedom was liberation. And you know, we have a remarkable document on this. Pericles' funeral oration, read carefully, specifies exactly this. These three notes, the card, it's just astonishing. We should say Thucydides rather than Pericles. Now, the Greeks did something else before I go on. I'm going to spend more time with the Greeks than other areas because I'm talking about the invention of the value. They did one other important thing. Not long before the many, as Aristotle would call them, socially constructed in their interaction, Zendoxa, the elites start to sniff at it. That's from the many. That's a vulgar idea. We're going to tell you what real freedom is. So began the philosophical history of freedom. Now, sometimes the smart, as Aristotle would say, do influence the outcome for value. And this is what happens. The inner introjection of the idea, true freedom, is inward freedom. And in Plato, as Vlastus, in a wonderful paper, which I go back to over and over, it's over 40 years old, the classicist George Vlastus pointed out in Slavery in Plato's Thought. If you don't believe what I'm saying, go and read that. He interjected all three notes. He talked about, you know, the slave impulses, and it's just liberation from those impulses is contemptible. The idea of freedom as control become important. That idea was extended by the Stoics, and Stoic philosophy is in many ways just an incredible interjection of this idea of the democracy of the soul, with the emphasis more on democracy. Inward freedom became critical. So this is important because this didn't remain with the philosophers. Very soon the idea was to filter down to the masses, to the many. So you see here an interesting dialectic between the smart, the wise, as Aristotle would call them, and the many here. And so that's why I'm not knocking philosophy, because the wise sometimes do have an effect in the emerging in doctrine, right? Now, the next big moment in the ancient world, in the history of freedom, and it was big, was the vast expansion of Rome. and Roman slavery, where slaves, freedmen, and their descendants by the late Republic, certainly by the early Empire, was a near majority, if not a majority, although this has been questioned in recent studies, but certainly no one disagrees that they constituted a huge section of the population. We find a decline, or what may seem on the surface, the decline of civic freedom, although not entirely. The idea persisted in many ways. Although it took first a rather Trumpian turn with Caesarean populism, the Vindex Libertatis. But the notion of freedom as power, absolute power, of course, received its perfect expression in the Augustan Auctoritas, as his biography makes clear. But more importantly, we find for the first time, really, a massive spread of freedom, of negative freedom. Because the interesting thing about the Greeks did manumit quite a few, but in Rome, manumission was amazing. Not only did they manumit a large number of people, but they did something which no other slave society has ever done, before or after. When you got manumitted, you became a Roman citizen. Certainly the Greeks would have been horrified by that idea. Of course, both your mother and your father had to be Greeks, so you had to achieve that. Romans did that. And something strange happened here with the idea of freedom, libertas, which became the central idea of freedom in Rome. Instead of being ashamed of the fact that you were once free, I think that even the typical ethic in Greece, and quietly, so you don't want to talk about that, right? In Rome, the freedman celebrated the fact that she was once a slave and is now free. And if you don't believe me, next time you go to Italy, go look at those hundreds of monumental inscriptions. They're all over the place. They're tombstone. Here's one of them. Publius Augusta Agatus Cortilius, freedman of Publius, silversmith. There he is. Does he? Look like a happy fella, doesn't he? I mean, see, they all were. Libertas, the fact that I was once a slave and triumphed out of it and became free. That this thing called libertas is the most proudest thing in my life. With that, freedom became thoroughly established, right? Along with the other two, which were more elite values. Okay, so we have this tripartite idea, okay? Still persisting. Something interesting to note. There was this complementarity that emerged, this rather perverse complementarity between the libertas of the freedman, okay, and the Augustan auctoritas, expressed in the imperial Lares cult, which was originally a very sort of Roman also cult, which under Augustus, however, achieved a new status in which the pinnacle of freedman achievement was to win office in that. But the idea here is that your freedom is guaranteed by your surrender to the genius, the absolute power of the emperor. Remember that. That's a new idea, a powerful one, a strange one, another strange. You begin to understand now why this thing is very Western, right? I mean, nothing like this exists anywhere else. This strange complementarity. But it's just to get even stranger. As we move to the next moment, critical moment, in many ways just as important, and the moment that explains the incredible continuity of freedom. What is that next moment? It took place in Rome during this period, and that was the Christian moment. There's no understanding of freedom in the West without an understanding of what happened with Christianity. Now, Christianity is not the religion of Jesus. Hope I don't startle you. It's not. Christianity Well, originally, Jesus was a very liberal guy who was very Jewish set of liberal beliefs, which he advocated. You know what he said about rich people and all the rest of it. No. Christianity became, that colonial idea was abandoned by Paul in Rome and under Roman influence. Christianity became not the religion of Jesus, but the religion about Jesus. And not even about Jesus' life and saying. It's really incredible. I read Paul very carefully. In all this, Paul only once ever referred to Jesus' sayings. It's really incredible when you think about it. He wasn't interested. Well, he may have been, but he didn't say anything. It's all about Jesus' death, which of course Jesus didn't have any sayings about. But something else happened. Under Paul, I've read him over and over, and I'm absolutely convinced of this. What Paul did was to interject in its entirety the Roman view of freedom. Part of the reason, of course, is who are the most influential people in the primitive church? Freedmen. Not the masses, but the most influential people, freedmen. Corinth, which of course is one of his happy hunting grounds, was actually remade under Caesar's command by freedmen. It was the freedmen city par excellence. And that's where Paul got a lot of his funding. So, there was this incredible interjection. What is Christianity about? It's about redemption. Do you know what the Latin root of redemption is? Redemptio. Do you know what it means? It means to buy someone out of slavery. Literally. That's what it means. There's no subtlety about this. Redemption, which if you turn on your radio any Sunday morning, that's the word you're going to hear most often coming from the Bible Belt. Redemption, redemptio. Jesus' life was then reinterpreted as an act of buying out the sinner enslaved to sin into liberty. That's the first move. That's the first move. Wonderfully expressed in the letter to the Galatians, which, by the way, came first, even though it's located after in the Bible. Okay? The first big letter. That's what Jesus did for you. On with the laws. You're free. We haven't heard, there's nothing like this in Western thought until John Stuart Mill later on. This is a celebration. You reap what you sow. I mean, it's just incredible. Go read Galatians. It's a celebration of negative freedom. So aimed directly at whom? Who are the guys for whom this would be central? Now, in much the same way that we say, I'm saved today, I'm redeemed by the blood of Christ. So the freedman was on this monumental inscription. I was freed on such and such a date. Okay? But Paul went further in the triad. He also took on the idea of freedom as surrender to a mighty power. And that's what the letter to Romans is all about. It's confused and confounded theological scholars for a long time, but if you know where its source was, there's no problem in understanding. So the earlier freedom in Galatians is the beginning, an earlier lesser freedom, still important. But if you really want freedom, you do what happened in the secular cult, the Lares Augusti, you surrender. In fact, he even used the word re-enslavement to God as the ultimate form of freedom. No, that's a wild idea, isn't it? But no, it's not wild when seen in the context of Rome. Nor did he end there. Didn't have democracy in the broader sense in Rome, but he also brought in, of course, the idea of freedom as a kind of democracy. Okay? He didn't neglect that third freedom. Membership in the church as participative sharing in the body of Christ, symbolically represented in the sacrament later on, that will culminate in the Eucharist. What Paul wrote of the incipient church, forming the basis of the fully developed medieval idea of the Corpus Christi, could in fact pass as an excellent description of democratic polity. The church was, quote, one body and one spirit, in which, quote, members are of one another. This is the Ephesians. Of the sacrament, he asked, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? That the participative feasting of the body and blood of Christ was an aspect of freedom was made clear by Paul when a few verses later in the same letter, he urged the Corinthians to liberate themselves from their dietary prohibitions and not be intimidated by the religious prohibition of others. Quote, for why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? It's amazing. It's pretty amazing. I mean, so you get then in Christianity the complete interjection of the triadic idea of freedom. Now, once that happened, that's it. Freedom was sealed in the Western consciousness. Why? Why? Because for hundreds of years, Western society is nothing more than Christendom. There's nothing else. Christianity was the conscience, the life, both spiritually and physically, outwardly, of the West. Is that persuasive? You begin to understand now why one of the common errors of the Middle Ages to claim that freedom died there, and then there's this 1,000 years gap, which was then the traditional story rediscovered in the Renaissance. That's all hogwash, okay? I mean, that's a traditional view you could really get. Freedom was alive and well throughout the Middle Ages. And the historiography is just beginning to catch up with that fact. But if you read the history, I mean, as Mark Brock pointed out, I mean, the history of the Middle Ages is a mystery of peasant revolts fighting for their freedom. Okay? And you find it in many ways. In many ways. Not only slavery exists, but the idea of freedom. We find in, they weren't writing the many, as Aristotle was called. But we can figure out what they were thinking from what they did. They were obsessive about buying their corporate and urban liberties. We hear a lot about the cities, but what is just as important to know is that the peasants in the countryside were just fighting just as much for village freedom, which is also possible, okay? So they not only revolt, they fought, they purchased their manumissions, they choose landlessness and movement continuously over the security of living under our Lord. There were the great land reclamation movements of the 11th to the 13th century, which I've discussed at length in a long paper on the Middle Ages. I wrote in a fest trip for David Bryan Davis. I think did you have a chapter in that? No, okay. And of course, there's the peasant revolts. But of course, quite apart from that, the church itself was important in maintaining the idea of freedom. In many ways, curbing lordly freedom, contesting the legitimacy of serfdom, the two swords idea, the duality of the swords, a very unusual phenomenon in the history of the world. The libertas ecclesiae model of secular institutions seeking freedom. You know, the fact that the notion of the peace of God, the monastic sanctification of work, and they've provided vocabulary for discourse and expression of freedom, all of it. And of course, you had freedom as lordly freedom, which is also existed. In fact, the medieval documents, if you read them, and there are hundreds, thousands of them, it's all about liberty. Usually the liberty of the Lord, sometimes quite perverse. One of my favorites was something, a southern British lord referred to as the liberty of galas. You know what that was? The freedom to hang anyone in my domain if I don't like it. So you had these three notes of freedom, but they also, the lords also, were aware of the other notes. They needed power to resist and the power to participate. This is what 1066 was all about, my friends. Okay? Parliaments and the power to resist. Okay, so it's just, if I want to get one thing out of your head, is the fact that you had this 1,000-year lacuna. It was not so. And the most cursory reading of the medieval documents, for heaven's sakes, makes it clear that freedom was alive and well. Both spiritually, of course, that's what the church was all about. But of course, you got this contestation. As you can imagine, the Lords love one version of Christianity, which is that they were the vicegerent of God. The whole Augustine idea persisted there, right? The masses, of course, didn't have access, and there are very good reasons why the masses didn't have access, because people knew that Christianity was dangerous. So the best way to do it was to do it all in Latin, right? Clever devils. But they never got away with it because they got to find out. Revolt after revolt was led by renegade priests who would tell them this is why. Now, by the way, the same thing in the American South. The reason why planters made it against the law for blacks to be taught to read is that they were dead scared of what happens if you start learning, especially if you start reading Paul, letter to the Galatians, okay? And that's happened in the Middle Ages. But they learned it. So, continuity, all right? Okay, modern freedom. Okay. I assume you know most of this story, all right? There are several myths I want to point out. The myth of the break with the ancient past, much overrated essay by Benjamin Constant about 2 centuries ago. It's often cited about it. It's just wrong. Not going to get there. You can talk about it afterwards if you want, but the Marxist and liberal Whig myth, it's one of those strange conjunctions, of capitalism as the major agent of modern freedom, right? The endlessly rising bourgeoisie was the one who brought us freedom. It's not true. A bit of it is true, yes, but that's the standard narrative now. Douglas North, who I like him, is an institutional economist, but he's wrong. Milton Friedman, of course, there's a whole lot. I mean, that's criticism, the view that freedom, that capitalism has an inherent thrust towards freedom. There's no such thing. And the comparative data, the global data makes this absolutely clear. Bismarck in Germany, Pinochet's Chile, wow, did they introduce capitalism? Wonderful. Well, why go back in the past? China. I mean, capitalism is a very promiscuous beast. They will sleep with any system. All you gotta do is recognize property, right? Property rights. That's okay. It's obvious by now. Capitalism thrives in China. Capitalism thrives in Singapore. It thrives in Pinochet's Chile. Oh, okay. There were, of course, important relationships, contingent historical relationships. What's more, there are continuities in the secularization, reinterpretation of the ancient and medieval code. Ernst Kantorowicz, one of my favorite historians of the late Middle Ages, a wonderful, huge book which you all should read, in which he lays down so persuasively the fact that early modern political thought and action on freedom is simply cryptotheological, all of it, or reinterpretation of the ancient text. What is the elite version? James I, the King of England, writing the true law of free monarchies, which is just a rehash of the Augustan view. Machiavellian discourses, which, as you know, is just a rehash of the ancient view. I mean, the 12 articles to go down to the bottom of the Swabian peasants, their godly law, Luther's theory of Christian liberty, Milton on God's law, John Locke, in case you don't know, is often seen as the source of modern liberalism, liberal thought. The best current interpretation of Locke is that it was really just applied theology. That's John Donne, who's just a wonderful scholar. That's the central thesis here. And if you read Locke carefully, and if you know your Christian doctrine, you'll see. You'll also, by the way, there are some books of Locke which I never read. It's only people like myself who go poking in who does it. But Locke wrote these incredible commentaries on the gospel. It's applied theology, so essentially. So I won't rehash the well-known developments. I assume that you're all well-educated here. You know the whole story, right? About absolutism and Reformation, about the British elite parliamentary system, which is often sneaked in as a kind of freedom. It wasn't, it's an elite system. The French Revolution, whose influence has been greatly exaggerated. I don't get into that. And so, I mean, certainly they did something for the rhetoric of freedom, but as for the actual fact, for Christ's sakes, I mean, more people were displaced by the American Revolution than from the elite of France. I mean, it's just one of these amazing things in Western historiography, the way in which the French Revolution is seen as this vast turning point in freedom. It was nothing of the sort. Did a lot for the rhetoric of freedom, though. The liberal movement and social democracy. You know the story, right? I can assume that, so I don't have to rehash all of that. I just want to say the good news and the bad news about modern freedom. So I'm going to start with the good news, okay? Which was after all the turmoil, you know, the wars of the religion, it was really chaos. I mean, when I read the newspaper about what's going on in Africa today, the way I keep my balance is to think about what's going on in Europe in the 17th century and 18th century, right? You know, I mean, it was pretty bad. It wasn't much better than what's going on in Africa. So the good news is that eventually out of this turmoil came the reintegration of the chord of freedom, the three notes of the chord, the welfare states, right? That in Europe, in Canada, and I'm saying this not just to please you, and in the other social democracy, what you got is the reintegration. Freedom as negation of inherited social power. You have the right to resist, not being bossed over, not being molested. Positive freedom, seen in the benign sense of power now. I didn't have the time to sort of go into that, but power, freedom of power doesn't have to mean freedom of domination over others, okay? It doesn't have to mean freedom over. It can also mean freedom to. And from the beginning, that idea was there. Empowerment, that's a nice word, okay? Think of it, think of empowerment. That's a nice ice cream word. I mean, empowerment, security, entitlement, rights. The freedom, or as Amartya Sen has made popular, capability, okay? That word has caught on for reasons I'm not sure about. And, you know, I love Amartya as my neighbor, but I don't know why. I mean, the world seemed to think that this was an original idea. But it's a nice word. Capability, freedom as capability. The capacity to achieve what you decide you want to achieve, right? That's positive freedom. That's power. It's also influence in one society, okay? So welfare state provides security. You're not just free to sleep under a bridge or free to starve. You're free to have some power to do, to be, to become. And of course, freedom as political, legal equality, participation in universal adult suffrage. That happened. That happened. That happens here. That happens in Western democracies in spite of all attention, and in Australia and elsewhere, okay? I don't have to tell you that story. You all know your Canadian history, right? So, but it emerged from entanglements. Now the bad news. There are three great fragmentations in the modern caudal triad of freedom, okay? The communist fragmentation leading to the totalitarianism of the left, the Soviet Union, and to some extent emerging again under Putin's Russia. The fascist Nazi fragmentation leading to the totalitarianism of the right, Germany, most notably Italy. And I'm afraid the liberal fragmentation leading to the iniquities of constitutional plutocracy, which is America, the leader of the free world. This first one you know, right? Now, wait, the point I want to emphasize is that all three involve freedom. They're all justified in the name of freedom. Don't forget that, okay? And it was freedom being fragmented. Freedom becomes dangerous when the cord is fragmented. And one way, of course, is through the dictatorship, so-called of the proletariat, the dismissal of negative personal freedom, the capacity to resist, in the positive freedom combined with the all-powerful state. That's communist totalitarianism, egalitarian totalitarianism, okay? That's bad. And whenever that, in that sense, Isaiah Berlin was right to be critical. He's wrong in some other respects, as I'll point out. Then there's the special case of Germany. Let's see. It's true that in the long run, Germany took the Western European path to social democracy. The course of this development, as the world knows to its cost, was devastatingly checkered. Germany's peculiar history as a Central European cluster of states only half within the Western community, its late unification, and its even later industrialization, together with its religious and cultural traditions, culminated in the 19th century in what Leonard Krieger calls the peculiar 19th century version of political freedom, unquote, one in which freedom was closely linked to princely and state power rather than being an enemy. Actually, in the long course of Western history, there's really nothing peculiar about this. It had been the Roman Emperor Augustus's view of freedom, etched in stone in his autobiography, the rest gets that, Divi, Augusti, and it was the dominant secular view during the Middle Ages, with Dante and others, who described in the early 14th century freedom was the great gift conferred by God on human nature, and it was most perfectly realized in and through a powerful godly monarch. Germany never quite gave up this ancient Augustan view of freedom. Instead, it did for the note of freedom as power what Western liberalism had done for the note of negative freedom, which we'll get to in a minute. It isolated it from the other two notes in the card and made it the only true freedom. In German, princes moved towards sovereignty from imperial control and absolute sovereignty within their own realms. Princely rights became the organic freedom of the nation, corporately shared by the people in their total identification with the state. It was this institutional connection between sovereign power and aristocratic liberties, writes Krieger, that gave liberté its inimitable connotation of a traditional corporate freedom necessarily associated with absolute state authority that made this kind of liberté the representative expression of German political liberty in the old regime, unquote. Germany's top-down modernization merely reinforced this pattern. The isolation and co-optation of the capitalist classes in Germany meant that liberty as an ideal had no contingent link, as it did in England, with capitalism. Instead, liberty became the darling of the Enlightenment intellectuals, themselves largely in the service of the state, elite, and in their hands it became a cultural and spiritual thing in the service of the nation and the folk. Kant, Emmanuel, who is celebrated among modern American liberals as their intellectual fountainhead, played some devious tricks with this liberty at home, along with Hegel and the other great German Enlightenment figures. He had no problem reconciling liberty with monarchical absolutism. And even more amazingly, he completely reversed the role and significance of the public-private distinction that was later to become such a central feature of Anglo-American liberalism. As Krieger notes, instead of assigning private opinions to individual freedom and their public expression to restrictions by social authority, Kant insisted that, quote, the public use of one's reason may always be free, while the private use of reason, on the other hand, may often be narrowly restricted without particularly hindering the progress of enlightenment. When a people's greatest seers of freedom took practical positions like that, the future course of their liberty was in deep trouble. Okay? Germany's humiliation at the end of the Great War proved even more of a disaster for liberalism, and there was an incipient liberal movement, than in the rest of Europe. And by the waning years of the Weimar Republic, it had been completely discredited. But where the attack on it came from the emerging social democratic left in the rest of Western Europe, the assault came from the nationalistic ethnocentric right in Germany by intellectuals such as Ernst Junger, Oswald Spengler, and Moller von Bruck, who expressed the collective mood in his assertion that liberalism causes nations to perish. The stage was culturally, politically, economically, and intellectually set for the Nazi triumph, who brought to its perverse conclusion the most dangerous potential of the Western tradition of freedom. And just remember, it's freedom. They're talking about freedom. Okay? So please, remember, I'm talking about not what is best for freedom. I'm not philosophizing here. I'm talking about what Aristotle talks about, the consensual views, right? Germany and the German people felt this was the ultimate expression of freedom. I actually had a rather bizarre sort of sense of this when I lived in Germany, southern Germany, in Trier. My landlady finally, we were having tea, opened up, and started talking about what had happened in Trier, which was completely destroyed in the war, but rebuilt. And she was saying, yeah, they were bad. It was bad. Now, once people start saying that, yes, it's like saying, yes, racism is bad, but you know it's coming. And she described the meetings, and her eyes watered up. And she was saying what it was like going to those meetings. I guess she wouldn't have said this, because I was a black foreigner and so on. She didn't care. She would say this, but this was amazing. It was freedom. It was the totality of the state. Freedom this is the Augustan freedom. This is the imperial freedman surrendering to the genius, the auctoritas of the emperor, of the state represented in the body of the Führer, right? This is freedom. This is one kind of freedom, and it's part of the West. This is not an isolated thing, okay? This is fascism. It's there, and it's easy to simply write it off as Germans and so on. Nonsense. This is part and part. So you see the dangerous nature of the fragmentation of that. Okay? So, I'm going a bit quick. Liberalism. You all think you know what liberalism is, don't you? So again, remembering the idea of a caudal triad. Essentially what liberalism did, it was another kind of fragmentation. This is another move away from the card, okay? This overwhelming emphasis on negative freedom. Ironically, of course, this is the freedom ultimately of the slave. So in a way, it becomes no surprise to me that liberalism became very anti-slave, because they're emphasizing the worst thing is to be under the domination of another. The best thing is to be away, to own yourself, to own your body, okay? Negative freedom became central. So it's understandable that liberalism, for all its conservatism, was anti-slavery, although they dealt with it in many different ways. There's Adam Smith, of course, who said, yes, it's bad, slavery is bad, but don't do anything. It's so inherently inefficient that it will crumble under its own weight. So we don't need an abolitionist movement. Well, others will think better. Extreme individualism, the hostility to positive freedom, which is most perfectly expressed in the writings of Isaiah Berlin. The state was demonized as the major threat to freedom. Now, this had certain consequences. You got the beginnings of the uncoupling of democracy from the semantic field of freedom, because, democracy, whatever you may want to think it is of necessity a movement involving the state. It's people power. It's public power. It's participation. Okay? And if you demonize the state, sooner or later, it's going to brush off. And liberals were aware of that. They were uncomfortable with democracy. So they grudgingly accepted it with the notion of the night watchman, the minimum seat, the state at least. You know the story, right? But there's another move of liberalism, which I want to emphasize tonight. because it's not emphasized enough. Liberalism did not give up on power. Now, here is one of the most marvelous tricks in the history of liberty. This was a move which was really classy. When you think of liberalism, and how often do we give right examination to our students, especially in political science, contrast liberty and democracy, or contrast liberty and power. Power is seen as the ultimate evil, right? There's no room for power in liberalism, right? Power is evil, right? You want to get away from it. Freedom is removal from that. Escape from that. Great, great act. How did they camouflage it? The wonderful concept, the notion of property. Property became sacred, right? But what the hell is property, if not power? Marx, in one of, I love the quotes, Marx, that goes back to my LSE days. This is one of my favorite ones. I still love the quote. Marx did a wonderful, wonderful description of the transition from feudalism to the modern world. Huh? We move from a world in which we exercise power over property and things through the exercise of power over people. That's feudalism, right? To a world in which we exercise power over people through our exercise of power over things. And it is power, my friend. Listen, when a CEO, with a stroke of a pen, can decide to destroy an entire community and send the Korea manufacturing air conditioning, the whole shebang, to Mexico at the stroke of a pen, destroying a whole community, hundreds of jobs. Man, that's power. That's power, right? That's even more power than any lord had. So power is there. Power remains central to the idea of freedom, but it's camouflaged under this idea of property, which is, it has nothing to do with power. Which, in fact, this is a negative thing. We're free. We're free property from constraints. Huh? The collapse, of course, of that idea in early 20th century Europe, the rest and the rise of the welfare state, the story you know, because they saw through that. What kind of power is this? What kind of freedom is this to starve under a bridge? So that's essentially the vision of the welfare state. You needed power to eat, to exercise influence in your community, to be able to educate yourself and so on. That's freedom, positive freedom. And Isaiah Berlin can write until his finger falls off. That is freedom, as many people are critical of. But he also needed freedom. To ensure that freedom, to guarantee both the negative freedom and the positive freedom which you have here in your welfare state, here. Many of you here are students who are being supported by the state. In America, you're bankrupt for life after you go through your education. You're indebted $500,000 you never paid off. And it's the one debt which you can't declare bankruptcy on. You get thrown into jail. Okay, power, you've got power. Ensured, guaranteed by the state, okay? That's the welfare. That's bringing the card back. It didn't happen. That trend did not happen in America. This is the last part of my story, okay? America has a complex history with freedom. Strange, strange things. First of all, there's the fact that freedom emerged in two parts of America, one of which was, of course, the slave South, in which you had an amazing reconstruction of what happened in ancient Greece. It's just incredible. It's just incredible. Almost exactly the same. There are parallels in history, but this is one of the great parallels. In fact, even right down to the proportions. I mean, we don't really know how many slaves there were, but the best guess by the best classicists whom I trust is about a third of the population of Athens were slaves, right? You know what? That was a figure in the South. They weren't the majority. The only two states that had majorities. It's about a third was the slave power. But more importantly, you had emerging this exact same thing that happened in Greece. The idea of a bond of solidarity among the whites who are free against the outsiders, the socially dead, the blacks. In fact, you had the added feature of race, who will forever remain outsiders. And in fact, to compensate, as in the same thing with ancient Athens, for the masses who were not very well off, you gave them political power. So what happened? Do you know what was the first state in the modern world in which the majority of free persons voted? It wasn't Geneva. It was Virginia. Democracy. Real democracy. Exactly. Herrenvolk democracy. Democracy. That's one source of America. Of course, you had the Puritan North, the sort of rise of Puritanism, and a more sort of early liberal version. And the two converged, led by whom? By what they call the confounding fathers. The confounding fathers. That's a wonderful stuff. I mean, listen to this. Do you know all the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Huh? There he was, writing this glorious thing. And went back and, sleeping with his sister-in-law. I mean, and in fact, he went to his noble grave without manumitting one of them, except the kids he bred. At least Washington was a little better. He had his hundreds of slaves in his will to be freed. The only trouble was that they were to be freed only after Mrs. Washington was dead. And poor Mrs. Washington spent the last days terrified that they were going to kill her. But at least he had them. These are confounding fathers. I mean, but they were the ones who led us to freedom, bringing the Southern Herrenvolk view of freedom, which, when allied to the Northern conscience, individualistic freedom of God, children of God, resulted in the notion of rights. Freedom as power became freedom as rights. It's a wonderful development. That's what that emerged. But of course, there's a crisis. It didn't last very long. That strange compromise in the Constitution where blacks were counted as, 3/4 or 4/5 or whatever the proportion. It is really so incredible. Culminated, of course, in Civil War. And here, talking about contestation. Lincoln is so amazing. I never tire of reading him over and over. But he expressed the contestation at the heart of not just American, but Western freedom when, in this amazing address. This is incredible. He wrote these things so, well, actually, he was very careful about writing them. But these little things, they're just amazing. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Oh, this is almost Marxian. Here are two not wholly different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. Now, they're amazing. But, it was Lincoln who was out of tune with history, in a sense. Because what the Southerners were doing, and by the way, they were aware of it. They loved to quote the ancients in the defense of liberty, and in the defense of that, and in the debates. Anyway, that was what something had to give. And liberalism, of course, became the dominant, won out. Although the South is still yearning for this liberty, that's what the commemoration is all about. Republican liberty versus the welfare state in America. Partial victories towards a reconverging of the card, some social security under Roosevelt. But it's a tough fight, and it was a partial victory. And one of the pernicious part of it was that group, which had made Southern freedom possible, was excluded from the Social Security. You don't know this, but the most pernicious part of the Social Security Act And the only way Roosevelt was able to get it through was that Southern planters, their descendants, insisted that one group of people, or a few group of people, or defined not in terms of race, but in all meant race, were to be excluded. Who? Domestics and agricultural workers on small farms. Almost 100% blacks were excluded from the Social Security provision, okay? That's democracy as it emerged, the attempt to introduce social democracy. Of course, there were changes. The civil rights movement challenged it, the women's and other rights movement, the union movement, okay? But the struggles, what seemed so promising in the 60s, and I'm old enough to remember that we were finally going to join Europe and Canada in bringing the cord of freedom back together. Didn't happen. Beginning with the Nixonian, the perverse Nixonian Southern strategy, it began to fall. The pushback, the diminishing welfare state, the collapse of the union movement. Every day we pick up the newspaper. They had a little victory last week in the Supreme Court. I don't know how long it's going to, but it's just merciless. The union movement is almost gone. The demonization of the state and Congress, the decline of democracy and voter apathy, the Patriot Act, which for a long time sort of really imposed severe restrictions on privacy. Mass incarceration, the fact that the American state, to its ultimate disgrace and shame, incarcerates more people than any other state in the history of the world, including Stalinist Russia. It's a fact. It's the leader of the free world. And massive inequality, which is made possible by the absence of a welfare state, which is getting worse and worse every day. The top 1%, in fact, gets all the benefits from globalization. So, in a sense, workers get screwed twice over. Because in Canada and Germany, in the welfare states, you do have globalization, but of course, it's buffered by the welfare state. So positive freedom is reinforced. No, essentially, they lose their jobs, they lose their communities, they lose everything, and there's no security in return because all the benefits of globalization, which the economists love to say, you get billions of dollars coming in, it's all going to the top 1%. That's what's happening there. And a flawed democratic process reinforced by a Supreme Court, which in its decision about campaign finance now has given total power to the rich to determine who gets elected. Okay? And I wanted to say one of the indoxa of Americans' view of freedom from surveys. Now, what has happened? What do the many, as Aristotle would call them, have to say about this? They still think they have a lot of freedom, more than any other country. So I've done several surveys, one in 2001 last year. And Americans claim to have a great, listen, look at that. Over 70% have a lot. And this is through all groups, okay? But what kind of freedom are they talking about? Now, what basically in a nutshell I've found is a highly privatized view of freedom. Essentially, they have a positive view of freedom, doing what one wants. Democracy has been removed completely from the semantic field of freedom. And there's no relation between the privatized view of freedom and power. Let me give you a perfect example of this. After 9/11, when everybody was scared to death, remember Bush gave a famous speech. He said, don't be afraid. They're not going to destroy our freedom. And this is the guy who mentioned freedom almost 40 times in the second inaugural speech. But anyway, this speech is important. Show them that you're free. Go out and shop. I kid you not. This is the essence of the privatized ways. Okay, that is freedom. Now, it's divorced from, and all my surveys, plus my in-depth interviews, I've interviewed lots of Americans last time, and we'll talk and talk and talk. And at the end, it's not that democracy is hated, but I'll interview with me and my assistant, someone, for almost 2 hours. They said, we've been talking about freedom for almost 2 hours. Well, you never mentioned democracy once. And so, yeah, of course democracy is important and so on, and this happens over and over again. Democracy is not part of the semantic field of freedom anymore. This is a success of the liberal assault on freedom, right? American notions of freedom. What's missing from this survey, the most important thing about this graph, is there's no reference to democracy. I did a second survey with one of my former students last year, and we use more modern techniques now of text regression to look at this in real depth. And what comes out in our text regressions, right, is that Americans define freedom in terms of the ability to do what they want to do, making choices, and the freedom of expression. There's no mention of democracy in any case, okay? And we also explore how people experience freedom. It's very interesting too. And the text regressions, again, are fascinating. Respondents largely talk about family, religion. Knowing God's make me the most free, going to church and traveling. Religious freedom, worshiping a church. These are the quintessential, these are the regressions show up, okay? They also talk about voting sometimes, but it is viewed with skepticism. This is just from last year. Freedom is most celebrated by those most hostile to the state. Look at that. You think healthcare is expensive now? Just wait till it's free. I mean, this is amazing. The Tea Party movement. Less taxes, less government, more liberty. That sums it up very well, right? And then I'm not going to show you the racist pictures of Obama, who is seen often identified either as Hitler or as a monkey. Pretty racist, okay? But that's where freedom is. So, but you have, however, the fact that these people are catching hell. Mass alienation. The Tea Party movement on the right results from the sense of impotence in the face of growing inequality, falling income, blamed on globalization, failure to provide buffer by the state, as I mentioned earlier, the loss of jobs and income, frustration with their Republican leaders. But the obvious solution, the Canadian solution, the West European solution, the Australian solution is off the table. They're hostile to the left and the Democratic Party due to the rejection of democracy. The fact that democracy is not thought, they're free, they're fighting for liberty, but democracy has nothing to do with it. It's outside the semantic field. They don't even think of, or to the degree that they do, it's bad. Though they're caught in a real bind. Hence, when people are in that situation, you turn to populism, racism. You go back to the old Augustine idea of finding your freedom by surrendering to the ultimate leader. Augustine Trumpism. Or, what comes out in the text regressions, you turn to religion, to the Christian idea of freedom. That's real freedom. That's the only freedom. I don't have a bother with these people. Forget it. But, okay. And that's where we're at. That's where we're at. But I want to show you just this last graph. Ask people how much, while they all agree that they have a lot of freedom, how much freedom has changed? And note here, you see this? That's Trump's people. See this? That is white males, especially unemployed ones. And only 30% of them who think that it's gotten better. The more freedom, less freedom. It's interesting, of course, black women are the ones who feel they're most gained in terms of freedom. But that's there. And by the way, this is almost exactly the proportion of Trump's votes. Interesting, isn't it? So, America faces a crisis of democracy with the near collapse of one of his two main parties, the Republicans. Huh? Only with the integration of the card of freedom will its democracy survive. But it can't. They're trapped in their ideology. Otherwise, the constant threat of populism and fascist movements such as Trumpism is what the outcome. And this is where the leader of the free world, the land of the free and the home of the brave, stands today. Thank you.
We now face a moment of unfortunate trade-off between the clock and the chance for student engagement, and I'm going to prioritize some chance for student engagement. I'd like to give at least a couple of students, 2 or 3 or 4 students, a chance to come up to the central microphone and ask Professor Patterson a question.
Looking forward.
Thank you very much for that presentation. My name is Matthew, and I'm with the Schiller Institute. My question actually first must be prefaced with a little citation of Benjamin Franklin, who was himself a devout hater of slavery and understood what he was dealing with when he was organizing these different divergent views within the Founding Fathers. But he said, when asked, what did you give us, a democracy? And he said, no, not a democracy, but a republic, if you can keep it. And I think that that's very insightful, because he knew that democracy, like Plato said, was the flip side of tyranny, the tyranny of the mob. And a republic is a very different idea. And when you look at what America has done today, looking at the presidential debates, they haven't done a very good job at keeping the idea alive of what it could have been. But the question relates to something which I think Benjamin Franklin would have disagreed with, some premises that you laid out. Because he himself knew, and this I think comes from the fact that he believed in universality. Mm-hmm. And he did so based on the idea that you needed to have a culture of, that encouraged the love of truth and the emotions associated with discovery, as his discovery of electricity that he devoted many years of his life towards, as well as the different philosophical associations and science groups that he encouraged in Europe and the USA attest to. So he knew that without that love of truth that transcends the pleasures that we share with the animals, a democracy, the ability of the people to vote and to think more deeply than the surface would not be there. So how would you respond to Benjamin Franklin today, or people who think like him, who deny the Aristotelian view that you laid out?
I would side with Aristotle. And you know, he's a pretty smart guy. I think smarter than Benjamin Franklin, if I may say so.
But he never discovered anything scientifically.
Maybe so, but you know, and he wasn't dismissing the wise. But he said, you know, you begin by looking at, to understand. Most ideas emerge from the people. I like to use the metaphor of language, and this perfectly illustrates Aristotle's point, that in a sense, language isn't created by the wise. Language is created collectively by the people in their interaction with each other. That's the phenomena, that's the endoxa, right? The wise will step back after gathering all the words and they say, hey, there's some patterns under here. It's grammar, it's syntax. But that's something still created by the people, right? Philosophy of language is another thing, right? That's created by the wise and so on, but that's something else. So I'm saying, no, a democracy has to be suspicious of that view, because you know what? It is too often the case, it has been too often the case in history, that when it's left to the wise take over and view the masses with contempt. It's hard to guarantee that the wise will not view the masses with such loathing that they will, in a sense, allow them the power that a true democracy requires. And so I understand what it is, and it's very frustrating. I mean, one you see is the Tea Party. When was, you know, the frustration is better expressed in that book. What's the matter with Kansas? These idiots, they're doing everything against their own interests. They're voting for the people who are going on and screwing them. What's the matter with Kansas? What's the matter with the masses? What's the matter with the fools? And it's easy to jump because also it's a Tea Party. What's the matter with the Tea Party? Their problem is they're complaining about inequality, but they're supporting exactly the people who are then going to Washington. They're beginning to wise up, by the way. But in spite of that, you know, I come from a democracy, which, believe me, if you think democracy is bad, you should go to Jamaica. In 1976, when I was advising the government, you know, I had to take cover so often. 700 people were killed in the elections. Violence. And violence in Indian democracy, too, is pretty rampant. So, yes. But when all is said and done, I still feel that when all the pluses and minuses are, that works. And the best solution then is to use democracy to guarantee that as many of the masses can become educated and join the ranks of the wise, if not them, their children, as possible. That's how I see it. And that's what guarantees the welfare state. And that explains the difference between why you have support for your education to become wise from the state, whereas in America, there's a crisis now of education. Because we have a situation where people keep saying, well, the jobs are going to go to China, to Mexico, and so on. What you need is to move up the value chain, get more and more educated. That's the story. It didn't work. It didn't work partly because the pace at which good jobs are going out is much faster than the pace at which people are being educated for the higher level jobs. And secondly, many people are just not willing or capable of shifting that fast, especially after you pass 50, right? But even so, you need re-education. You really need a sympathetic state, and you don't have that. And you don't have that because in America now, the shots are called by the wealthy. I mean, it's obscene what's happening. After the Supreme Court opened the doors, the Supreme Court defines companies as people. That's crazy. That's what we have. So hopefully the democracy will be restored. We will have a reversal of that Supreme Court decision, which has just ravished American democracy. It's very sad. I read the New York Times and the Boston Globe every day. It breaks your heart. You know, you have these people going up, like paying penance to these billionaires. And anyway, you know the story. So my position is you need to educate people, but they're not going to be educated if the state doesn't intervene in the way in which it does in Canada, in the welfare states, and so on. We have an educational system which is run on a crazy basis. Real estate taxes. It's pernicious. It means that the people who live in the bigger houses get the better schools. Anyway, you know. So my simple answer is the wise, and there are lots of wise people on Wall Street. In fact, all my smartest students are going to Wall Street, okay? All of them. And within a few weeks, they're earning 10 times what I earn. So that's where the wise are going. That's your problem. Yes, sir.
Yes,
ma'am.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank you a lot for your enlightening genealogy of freedom in the Western culture. I was quite surprised that some concepts such as race, imperialism, and colonization were relatively marginalized in your overview. And I was wondering if you had something to say specifically on race, since the race concept as a social social construct, has been central to the shift between the freedom of property over person to the principle of colonization, which lies on the idea of freeing people from the dominion of nature. And I referred to one of your compatriot, Charles Mills, and his interpretation of race.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
So, in a way, well, I'm just completing a short history of freedom, which brings all these ideas, and so I didn't have enough time. Could have gone on for another hour. I could have gone on for another week. When I talk about slavery, I'm talking about race. And this is true even of the ancient world. I mean, there's a myth about the ancient world, by the way. It goes back to Snowden, that there was no race in the ancient world. But, the Athenians were about as chauvinistic as you could get. I mean, it's confusing how people look with the idea of race. But they are very chauvinistic. And all the people who were slaves you could not enslave a fellow Greek in the city. They were other races, whether it's Scythians or whatever. And of course, and the same goes throughout the Middle Ages. Black Africans were not the first people who became identified as a race group. In the Middle Ages, in fact, the reason why all the European languages, no matter what family they belong to, have the same root for slaves, Slav. is because one race, and they were viewed as a race, who became the slave race, in the same way that African and those were Slavs, okay? This goes right through Renaissance Italy, and so on. So when I mention slave, almost always I mean race. It's implicit. I'm sorry I didn't spell it out. And of course, my very first book, Sociology of Slavery, was a detailed, archivally based analysis of 18th century Jamaica, which is the worst slave system in the world since Cato's Rome. The only other thing I can find close is in the Agricultura. That was, so yeah, I also didn't mention women, and there's some, and I explore at length the feminist critiques of the whole theory of freedom, especially liberalism. Of course, thank you. Freedom, and from a social constructivist point of view, in which she points out that, in fact, the liberal interpretation, which it's number one, fails to, with its universalism, if you like, fails to recognize the socially constructed nature of freedom, but also fails to look at the inner nature of freedom. It neglects in a patriarchal way what are the central concerns of women. So I have all of that. I couldn't bring it in. I wish I could. I didn't have the time, but I totally agree. Okay, sorry. Yes.
The hour is late and a reception is waiting for us, but we have additional important work to do before we adjourn. The liberal arts in a university setting often depend on the generosity of those with a strong commitment to the university, and in particular, their alumni. Interdisciplinary research, which doesn't generate easily patentable, easily commercializable industrial goods, often depends on the generosity of those with commitment to their university. And the ability to integrate research with teaching, the ability to bring ideas into student life and to allow the exchange of research in ways that will then be brought to student attention rather than being isolated in the grant-attracting laboratory, which of course has its own virtues. That especially depends on the generosity of those with a commitment to the university. These aren't things that can happen just out of the cycle of research grants or industry partnerships. They depend on a commitment to the educational mission of the university as a whole. Everyone will in due course be called upon to express that generosity. But we have been very privileged to have a close developing relationship over the last several years with Dr. Jan P. Lin, PhD class of 1992, who, working especially with the leadership of then Dean of Arts, now Provost Manfredi, and over the course of our transition into an existing center with the deans Hudson Meadwell and Jim Nicell. The faculty group I named at the beginning have been developing the plan for the center in cooperation with and under challenge from Dr. Lin to find work that was worth doing and do it better. So I'd like you to join me for a few moments in thanking for his generosity, his series of gifts that will ultimately total $3.4 million in support of the center, and for his interest in seeing ideas move around and exchange and deepen and enrich at this university, Dr. Jan P. Lin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the generous words. I hope I deserve it. And here I would like to thank Professor Patterson for the wonderful presentation. It's great. I may not agree all of them, but I really appreciate it. Really. And Professor Patterson and Professor Manfredi, I'm not sure if he's here, and Professor Nicell, and Professor Midwell, and of course, Professor Levy. And all professors, our students, are my friends, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are very happy to have such a wonderful presentation. And the Yan-Ping Center has a quite ambitious mission, which Professor Levy has already talked about. And he's an outstanding scholar and a staff professor, as I was told. I'm very happy you are the leader of this center. And the other day, Jacob and I talked in the lunch, and we are talking about how we should run this. And of course, I learned from him. He had these 5 pillars. You know, he just mentioned 5 pillars. These are the, let me mention that again. First, the global antiquity, and the transitions and global modernity, and the 3, it's constitutional studies, and the global justice, and the democracy, space, and the technology. These are the 5 pillars Jacob has brought in. Some are new, some are old, and these are wonderful. And so I said to him, you know, I had all these ideas about the bridges. So these are the past, the bridges between past and the present, and the West and the East, and the humanity and the science. So I mentioned these as 3 bridges. I would like to connect them because I think they should be connected, but somehow they are disconnected. So I said, Jacob is the pillar man, I should play the bridge man. So these are quite complicated tasks that I discussed with Jim and also Hassan. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. So I believe over time we will probably have more pillars as the building gets bigger and taller, and more bridges as we reach farther and wider. Jacob has been focusing on the building these pillars. You know, one day we will have a palace. I'm trying to build some bridges so that one day people can, all over the world, can cross these bridges to our palace. When I talk about the bridges and the pillars, I'm immediately reminded by the Patterson over the Acropolis in Athens, and the oration by Pericles, the first citizen of Athens, then in 431 BCE. The magnificent temple was ruined now, but the pillars are still standing, enduring thousands of years, natural disaster and artificial catastrophe. I'm sure Jacob and we will build some pillars like them. Time has passed faster than we can catch it. 2,500 years or so have gone by, but we have not really had much time to reflect properly what have happened and what we have learned. Maybe not much, given the similar mistakes we have made over and over again. Today, we are facing even more serious challenges. One of them, political correctness versus freedom of speech, as one of the dilemma among many. They are no longer coexisting but conflicting. The gap between them is getting wider and deeper by the days. So how do we deal with them? Of course, we cannot connect the whole world with only 3 bridges. We cannot build a palace with only 5 pillars. Thus, we need a lot more. Thus, we need contributors. And this evening, Professor Patterson did this for us, and I believe his works are both pillars and bridges. Bravo. Let us work hard under Jacob's leadership and the help of everyone, and also the help from the deans, our provost, to make the center Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Lin. Thank you to Professor Patterson. Thanks to you all for coming and helping us launch this new initiative at McGill. And please join us outside for a reception.